A really important assumption of utilitarianism is that happiness can be quantified. Okay, so let's take a look at what Mill says here. Mill says the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Okay, so quantity of happiness. So this is what Bentham and Mill would say. They'd say, let's say that you have the opportunity to choose action A. Okay, action A will result in consequences that will create 8 units of happiness in this strapping man here. Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest amount of happiness that a person can experience, action A is going to produce 8 happiness units in this man here. On the other hand, we could take action B. Action B won't generate any happiness units for this man. At most, it'll generate 1 happiness unit for him. But it'll generate 3 happiness units in these 8 people here. 8 times 3 is 24. So action A will result in 8 happiness units that wouldn't otherwise exist. Action B will result in 24 happiness units that wouldn't otherwise exist. Therefore, according to the logic of utilitarianism, action B is the right action to take. Okay? And that's sort of counterintuitive because you think, well, wait a minute, if the scale is 1 to 10 and there's an action that has the potential to produce 8 happiness units in this one person, that means that life is going to be sweet for this one person for however long that happiness lasts. And 3 happiness units for 8 people? That doesn't sound like a lot on a scale of 1 to 10. But nonetheless, we can sort of calculate this out. We can calculate out the amount of happiness in total that actions A and B will likely create. And you sort of see this, you see this same kind of thinking in our discussion of the trolley problem, where we were saying, look, all things being equal and not knowing anything about these people on the tracks here, I know that if I don't change the course of the track and allow the trolley to run over these 5 people here, the amount of suffering that's going to be brought into the world is going to be much more immense, likely, than if I switch the tracks and allow it to run over this one person, because all of the family members of these people, their friends, their economics, all of these things are going to take a hit, right? They're going to take a negative hit, and the negative hit will be greater because it multiplies per person. Okay? And we sort of see this same kind of rationale when we think about medical triage, right? We have some number of people who show up at the door with different degrees of injury. And we know that to be successful, we want to try and save as many people as possible. So we prioritize who gets treated in a way that we think will result in the greatest amount of happiness, the greatest amount of contentment. In this case, the greatest amount of life and the least amount of suffering. Okay, so now you're thinking to yourself, like, okay, all of this talk about quantifying happiness and happiness units, this makes no sense to me. How do we even begin to do this? Well, Bentham has an answer for us. It's called his Calculus of Felicity, and it works like this. He says, okay, let's say you're contemplating a particular action. Let's say I'm trying to decide whether or not it's okay, it's morally permissible to do X, or it's morally required to do X. And Bentham would say, all right, well, if you do X, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being totally intense, how intense will the pleasure be if you do X? Okay, so assign that pleasure that you think you have good reason for anticipating if you do action X. And think about how long the pleasure will last. What's its duration? So you're going to do action X. What reasons do you have for believing that this pleasure will last a long time? If it's going to last forever, give it a 10. If it's going to be a fleeting experience, give it like 0.5. How sure are you that action X will actually produce the pleasure that you're banking on here? If you're certain it will, give it a 10. If it's a total gamble, maybe give it a 1. How soon are you going to experience this happiness if you perform action X? What's its proximity? What's the proximity of this happiness? If it's going to be right away, give it a 10. If it's going to be a long way off, give it a 1. If you do action X and you produce a certain amount of happiness, how much other kinds of happiness are going to result from this? In other words, who else is going to be happy? What other kinds of things might they do that they wouldn't ordinarily do because they've experienced this happiness? How much will this happiness grow from action X? And how free from pain is this happiness? In other words, if we do action X and it entails some amount of pain, we want to take that into our calculation. So if action X is pain-free, give it a 10. If it's got a lot of pain associated with it, give it a 1. And how many people will experience this pleasure, right? How many people are going to be impacted by action X, okay? And Bentham would say, or sort of, he didn't say this, but it's sort of, it's thought that he made the decision about whether to marry using this calculation of felicity, right? And you can see that when it gets down to the bottom, the extent, how many more people will experience this pleasure? Well, I've got to take family, friends, other people who were interested in marrying me and their pain when I marry someone else. I've got to take all of those things into consideration. I've got to try to assign numerical values to all of these qualities and also run this sort of model assuming that I don't take action X, that I don't marry. Then what kinds of pleasures can I anticipate? He would say you could make this decision about whether or not to go to college, right? You go to the party or you go to college. Well, the party's got pleasure that's going to have a really high proximity score because we go to the party, it's right there. We go to college, maybe the pleasure is a long way off when we're established in our career. So the proximity is a long way away. We could apply this calculus of felicity to situations like with the Cookie Monsters, right? The women who stole the Girl Scout cookie money, right? We could take that situation and say like, okay, well, how much pleasure was generated by their actions? Okay, they stole that money. What was the pleasure that was created? Well, she put gas in her car. It looks like she got a coffee from Starbucks. But we probably also have to consider the pleasure of that little girl who had the cookie money stolen from her. Yeah, because even though it probably sucked when she got the cookie money stolen from her, I bet you she raked it in after that news story went out. And she got to see herself on TV, and it's like all of a sudden, people are probably swarming to her to buy those Girl Scout cookies, which means that now we have to take into account the Girl Scout organization and her troop and how much they benefited from the actions of these women. All right. So we might, and you probably do something like this in your own life, right? You do a cost benefit analysis of things. If I do this, what's it going to cost me? But what will be the benefits that I get? And that's the kind of logic of utilitarianism.